Don your armor and draw your weapons, because it's time to throw down. But this is more than just hacking and slashing at each other, because even an outnumbered party can win against all odds if they think strategically. In this video, we'll be going over the structure of combat in D&D, and the opportunities that you have as a player to contribute to the mayhem. Due to its history starting as a war game, D&D can feel most like a board game when it comes to combat. Players and enemies take turns to attack, there are certain actions you can perform, and there's a sense of strategy and teamwork as your party decides on their positioning and the kinds of roles they fill in combat. However, combat doesn't always have to feel this way. There are two main ways that combat can be portrayed at a table. Some groups prefer playing with a drawn map and miniatures they can move around. This is helpful because everyone can see where things actually are in relation to each other, but it's more work for the DM. Some DMs prefer what's called theater of the mind, meaning that everything that happens isn't concrete on the table for everyone to see. Instead, everyone relies on what they see in their collective imagination based on what is told to them by the DM. This relies heavily on good descriptions from the DM and players asking questions. DMs can also use a mixture of these two styles, and I do this as well. If my players don't quite understand what I'm describing with theater of the mind, I'll do a quick drawing on a piece of paper and use it for reference rather than as a grid map. But regardless of which method you use, they both need a solid combat system or it would just be absolute chaos. I'll begin by breaking combat down to its basic structure in D&D. Combat is when two or more opposing sides engage in battle. Combat is broken down into rounds, and each round consists of players and monsters taking turns. The order of turns is decided at the beginning of combat, where everyone will roll for initiative. If one side hasn't been defeated by the end of the round, a new round begins, using the same initiative order that was rolled at the beginning of combat. It's commonly accepted that each round of combat is 6 seconds of in-game time. What may be a couple of hours to us as players may be less than minutes for the characters. Before a fight begins, we have to determine if one group has gone unnoticed by the other, usually through hiding. If so, members of the group not hiding might be considered surprised. If neither side is trying to be stealthy, each group will automatically notice each other and no one will be surprised. If one group is trying to ambush the other, each member of that group must roll dexterity stealth checks and beat the passive wisdom perception scores of the members of the group they're trying to ambush. Unless members of the targeted group were actively looking for hidden creatures, then those members will get to roll a wisdom perception check instead, as a skill contest against the hidden group's dexterity stealth checks. Any individual that fails to notice the ambushers will become surprised during the first round of combat. Some group members can fail at this even if others succeed. For any characters who do become surprised, simply put, they miss their first turn in combat. Mechanically, their turn still happens, but they cannot move or take any action on their first turn. They also cannot perform any reactions until after their first turn passes. However, anyone who is surprised will still roll for initiative along with everyone else. Rolling initiative is the way that D&D determines turn order in combat. On your character sheet, there is a box near the top center that says Initiative. Here, you'll enter your dexterity modifier, and we'll call that number your initiative bonus. You'll roll the d20 and add this number to determine your initiative. Every other player will also roll, and the DM will roll initiative for all the NPCs. The DM will keep track of everyone's initiative, including enemies, from highest to lowest, and this becomes the initiative order, or turn order. This will stay the same from round to round. In the event of initiative ties, the DM makes the call on what happens to see who goes first. Some examples might include whoever has the higher initiative bonus. Roll the d20 again without adding bonuses and see who rolls higher. Or if it's two players that are tied, they can decide between themselves who goes first. Now that we're entering the fray, what do you get to do? On your turn, you may perform one action and use your movement to travel a distance less than or equal to your character's speed, which is determined by your race. You may also break up your movement. You can use some of your movement, perform your action, and then use more of your movement. Attacking and casting a spell are the most common actions a player will make. There are more action options that can be performed, such as dashing, dodging, and hiding, the details of which can be found in the Actions in Combat section, starting on page 192 of the Player's Handbook or page 74 of the Basic Rules. Certain features and special abilities also give access to an additional action called a bonus action. However, you can only take a bonus action when you have a feature or spell that allows you to do so. For example, normally you have to use an action in order to hide. However, a second level rogue can hide as a bonus action because of their cunning action feature. Anything that prevents someone from taking their action also prevents them from taking their bonus action. Bringing it back to being surprised, when you become surprised, you don't get to take an action. Therefore, you also don't get to perform a bonus action. Characters also have access to a reaction, which is an action in response to a certain trigger. The most common reaction is the opportunity attack. If someone tries to leave your melee range, you can use your reaction to attack them. You only have one reaction per round, and you get it back at the beginning of your next turn. So, if two creatures leave your melee range, you'll only be able to attack one of them with your reaction. With the structure of battle now in place, let's go over how to attack and deal damage. When it comes to attacking enemies in D&D, it's broken into two segments. The first is the attack roll to determine if you can actually hit your enemy, and then if you succeeded at that, next is the damage roll to determine how many hit points you remove from them. Let's figure out how to hit our opponents by discussing the attack roll first. Regardless of whether you're using a melee or ranged weapon, or casting an attack spell, you'll follow this order of events. Pick your target, determine modifiers, and then resolve the attack. However, I'm going to change the second and third steps to something a bit more understandable. I'm going to change them to determine external factors and make the attack roll. Let's pick our target. Your target must be in range. When using a grid map, each square counts as 5 feet. Melee weapons can hit targets adjacent to you on a grid or within 5 feet of your character, unless otherwise specified. Ranged weapons have two different numbers listed for their range. The first number is the normal range, and the second is the long range. If you target a creature beyond your normal range, you will be attacking with disadvantage. You cannot target a creature beyond your long range. Another quick recap on advantage and disadvantage. You roll the d20 twice. If you have advantage, you take the higher roll. Disadvantage would take the lower roll. Ranged attacks are less effective when a foe is in melee with you. This goes for both ranged spell and ranged weapon attacks. You have disadvantage on ranged attack rolls against any target, as long as an enemy is within 5 feet of you that can see you and who isn't incapacitated. The next step is to determine external factors. Spells and other special abilities may apply bonuses or penalties to your attack roll, so determine if there are any such factors affecting you. Your DM will also tell you whether you have advantage or disadvantage on the attack roll, or if your target has cover. There are 3 degrees of cover. You have half cover if half of you is blocked, you have 3/4 cover if 3/4 of you is blocked, and you have total cover if you are completely behind cover. Each degree of cover provides a bonus to armor class and dexterity saving throws, making it harder to hit such a target. In the case of total cover, you cannot be hit, unless a spell sets off an effect that can reach the target, such as a nearby explosion. Our last step is to make the attack roll to see if your attack hits your target. The most common modifier you will add to your attack roll is your attack bonus, which we calculated when we covered equipment. You should be able to find that in the middle of your character sheet, under Attack and Spellcasting. The number next to the name of your weapon is your attack bonus. To calculate your attack bonus, if you're using a melee weapon, you use your strength modifier and add that to the attack roll, while ranged weapons add your dexterity modifier. And if you're proficient with the weapon you're using, you also get to add your proficiency bonus. Weapons with the thrown and finesse properties break this rule, as mentioned in the equipment episode. If the d20 roll with the added modifiers is equal to or higher than your target's armor class, or AC, your DM will tell you that you have hit your target, and you can now deal damage. There are two special instances that affect attack rolls, and they occur when you roll a 1 or a 20 on your d20. A roll of 1 will result in an automatic miss, regardless of modifiers. People often refer to the rolling of a 1 as a critical fail or natural 1. The opposite is true when the die rolls 20. This is called a critical hit or natural 20, and automatically hits its target. By the rules of the book, these critical rolls only happen when an attack roll is being made. But it isn't uncommon for DMs to apply special effects on rolls of 1 or 20 when players make ability checks or saving throws as well. It can lead to fun or silly moments within the game. Anyway, let's get back to combat. You've just hit your target, and we now need to apply damage. Just as players have hit points, so do all NPCs and monsters. When a creature is reduced to 0 hit points, they are considered dead or unconscious depending on the circumstances. Whatever you are attacking with, whether it's a spell, weapon, or ability, it should tell you what dice you will be rolling to deal damage, and should be under attacks and spellcasting on your character sheet. We'll use Mickey Tumblerun's mace as an example. It rolls 1d6 for its damage, and I'll roll that now. Weapons also add a bonus to their damage equal to the ability modifier that was used in your attack roll. For example, if you used your strength modifier to hit, you will add your strength modifier to the damage as well. You do not add proficiency to the damage. If you scored a critical hit, that means that you will get to roll double the number of dice you would normally roll for damage. After rolling, add any modifiers or bonuses to damage as normal. These do not get doubled. In the case of Mickey Tumblerun's mace, he would get to roll 2d6 instead of the normal 1d6, and then after rolling them, would add his strength modifier. If there is a feature or spell that was already allowing you to roll extra dice for the damage, such as a rogue sneak attack, you will get to roll double the dice for the feature or spell as well. When you deal damage, it is associated with a certain damage type. Each weapon, spell, and special ability that causes damage will specify which type of damage it deals. The 3 common types of damage dealt by weapons are bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. The other damage types include acid, cold, fire, force, lightning, necrotic, poison, psychic, radiant, and thunder, which is concussive sound and not electricity. It's important to say what type of damage is being dealt, as some creatures have resistances or vulnerabilities to certain damage types. Resistance means a creature takes half the damage rolled by that damage type, while vulnerability means a creature will take double the damage. There are also immunities, meaning a creature takes no damage at all from certain types of damage. As battles carry on, creatures will continue to take damage and reduce the amount of hit points they currently have. Eventually, an accumulation of damage will become too great, causing characters to fall in battle. Character death is something that can happen. Typically, this means that you will just create a new character. But there are spells in the game that can bring characters back from the dead, so there is a possibility for a character to return. When you take damage, it's important to keep track of your current hit points, or HP. There aren't penalties for losing hit points until they reach 0. You don't die when you reach 0 hit points, but instant death does exist. When you're reduced to 0 hit points and there is still damage remaining, if that excess damage equals or is greater than your hit point maximum, your character will die outright. If you have dropped to 0 hit points and you weren't instantly killed, you will instead fall unconscious and will begin rolling death saving throws, as your character is in the process of dying. You make a death saving throw on any turn that you start with 0 hit points. A death saving throw, or a death save, is a unique type of saving throw in that it isn't tied to an ability score. Instead, it is just a straight d20 roll with no bonuses. If you roll a 10 or higher, the roll is considered a success. Less than 10 is a failure. You will need to keep track of the number of successes and failures, and can do so in the death saves box on your character sheet. If you roll 3 failures before 3 successes, your character dies. When you roll your third success, however, your character becomes stable. This means that they remain unconscious, but are no longer dying. When rolling your death saves, if you roll a 1 on the d20, it counts as 2 failures. Any damage to a character rolling death saves counts as 1 failure, or 2 failures if the damage is from a critical hit. If damage from a single attack equals your hit point maximum and you're still rolling death saves, your character dies instantly. But if you roll a 20 on a death save, you regain 1 hit point and are no longer unconscious. Once you become stable or regain any hit points, the death save counter resets to 0 successes and failures. Your allies can also attempt to save you while you're making death saving throws. A character can use their action to try and administer first aid, requiring a DC 10 Wisdom Medicine check to stabilize a creature. If a stable creature takes any damage, they begin making death saves again, but with the counter reset. A stable creature that doesn't receive healing will regain 1 hit point after resting for 1d4 hours. Sometimes a character may want to knock a creature unconscious instead of killing them when they drop to 0 hit points. To do so, the attack must be a melee attack. It can be a melee weapon or melee attack spell. The instant the damage is dealt, the attacker can declare that they want to knock the target out instead of killing them. If the damage puts the target to 0 hit points, the target falls unconscious and becomes stable. Most DMs have monsters die the instant they drop to 0 hit points, instead of bothering to roll death saves for them. So this could be important to declare if you want to keep one enemy alive, for example, for the purpose of interrogating them. So what we should have learned after all this is losing your own hit points is less than ideal. If your hit points are running low, there are methods of healing your wounds. Spells such as Cure Wounds can heal in an instant, and there are also potions of healing which you might find or purchase. These methods are good for quick fixes in the middle of combat. When you receive healing, add the hit points regained to your current hit points. You cannot exceed your hit point maximum, so any extra hit points healed above your maximum are lost. If a creature has died, meaning that it failed all 3 of its death saves, it cannot regain hit points, unless it has been brought back to life through magical means. If a stable creature receives healing, it returns to consciousness and no longer needs to make death saves. Some spells and special abilities grant a buffer from damage called temporary hit points. It's important to note that temporary hit points aren't actual hit points, so they aren't a source of healing. They are a protective barrier for your normal hit points and should be thought of separately. When you have temporary hit points and receive damage, the temporary hit points are lost first. If the damage exceeds the amount of temporary hit points you have, the excess damage will begin damaging your normal hit points. Since temporary hit points are separate from your normal hit points, they can exceed your hit point maximum. Therefore, you can receive temporary hit points even when you are at your hit point maximum. However, you can't regain temporary hit points through healing, nor can you combine temporary hit points from multiple sources. If you already have temporary hit points and then receive more of them, you must decide whether to keep your current temporary hit points or accept the new number. Temporary hit points can't stabilize a dying character, only shield them from incoming damage, as with a conscious character. They will need actual healing to be saved from death. Unless the source of temporary hit points has a duration, they will last until they're depleted or after you've finished a long rest. D&D's version of a good night's sleep. The last subject within combat that we'll be covering are special forms of combat. Not every fight that characters get into will be on foot. In fact, it might not even be on land. There are some special rules that accompany fighting from the back of a mount, as well as the odd occasion that you might have to fight underwater. If you decide that you want to use mounted combat on horseback, or whatever creature you can find, some rules change as you are now playing as 2 creatures working together. Firstly, whatever creature you're riding needs to be willing, have an anatomy that makes sense to be used as a mount, and be larger than you. Getting on your mount will cost you half of your total movement speed. If you don't have enough movement speed, you won't be able to get on your mount. And as a rider, you are at risk of being knocked off. If your mount is moved against their will or something attempts to knock you prone, you need to make a dexterity saving throw to stay on, the DC equaling 10. Or if your mount is knocked prone, you can use your reaction to land on your feet. If you do not, you fall down next to your mount. If the creature you are riding is an intelligent creature, such as a dragon, it will act of its own will and have its own place in the initiative order, going where it wants and using its own actions. You can control a mount with less intelligence, but it must have been trained to accept a rider. This kind of mount will share your turn in combat, using the same initiative you rolled. But it will have its own action and movement that you can control. The only actions your mount can use are the dash, disengage, or dodge actions, which can be found on page 192 of the Player's Handbook or page 74 of the Basic Rules. Regardless of your mount's intelligence, if your mount provokes an opportunity attack while you're on it, the attacker can target either the mount or the rider. If riding atop a horse wasn't enough, having to fight underwater presents new challenges for fighters. Making melee attacks underwater will have disadvantage, unless the character attacking has a swim speed through magical means or from being an aquatic creature. Or the weapon being used is a dagger, javelin, short sword, spear, or trident. Ranged weapons also suffer disadvantage underwater, unless the weapon used is a crossbow, a net, or is a thrown weapon that is thrown like a javelin, so this would include spears and the like, but a throwing axe wouldn't count. Ranged weapons also cannot target creatures past their normal range while underwater. And lastly, any creatures or objects that are fully submerged have resistance to fire damage. It can be easy to think about combat as a race to see which side loses all their hit points first, but a lot can be said about a way the character fights. Consider how your character fights. Are they graceful? Do they put their full strength behind every swing? Are they calm and stoic as they pull back their arrow and release? If you're a spellcaster, is there a theme to the spells that you use? Are they mostly related to a certain type of elemental damage? What do they look and sound like when they're cast? If you love using fire magic, for example, is it normal fire? What about blue fire? Maybe even a shifting rainbow of colors can be seen in the fire you cast. If your character is heavily geared toward combat, find a way to make combat their opportunity to roleplay. Also, interact with the environments that the DM sets up during combat. Are there levels? What happens when you get to a higher elevation? Is there a chandelier to swing from? What about furniture? Push it over and use it as cover. What happens if you push this button on the wall? These types of interactions can make for interesting combat. And this episode has mostly been the basics of combat. There are some combat-related things we didn't go over in this episode, so if people are looking for clarifications on other combat-related rules, let me know and I'll make videos addressing such rules in the future. For now, let's leave the fighting in the past. In the next episode, we're going to explore the rules for exploration. Until then, remember to be kind and play dicely.